collision of two worlds. Ethan groaned as his head throbbed. The cold, metallic floor beneath him sent chills through his body. Blinking rapidly, he tried to focus his vision. Where was he? The last thing he remembered was working on a cargo ship. Now, he was in a strange, dimly lit room with walls made of sleek, silver metal. A faint hum of machinery echoed around him. "Where am I?" Ethan muttered, his voice raspy. Suddenly, a calm yet authoritative voice broke the silence. "You're awake. Good. I was beginning to think humans were as fragile as they looked." Ethan turned sharply toward the source of the voice. Standing near the control panel was a tall alien woman with radiant, deep blue skin and shimmering silver eyes. Her presence was commanding, her posture regal, and her expression unreadable. She was dressed in flowing garments that seemed to glow faintly, as if woven from starlight. "Who are you?" Ethan asked, pulling himself to his feet. "And what is this place?" "I am Princess Lyria of the Zetheri Empire," she replied, her tone curt. "As for this place, we are aboard the Ecliptica, a Zetheri vessel currently stranded in hostile space." "Stranded?" Ethan repeated, confusion etched on his face. "What am I doing here?" Lyria's eyes narrowed. "I was going to ask you the same question. My ship picked up an unidentified human drifting in an escape pod. Against my better judgment, I brought you aboard. Now, you owe me your life." Ethan felt a mix of gratitude and unease. "Thanks, I guess, but how do I get back to my crew?" Before Lyria could respond, the ship's AI interrupted. "Attention. Emergency lockdown initiated. Unknown threat detected in proximity to the Ecliptica. All systems compromised." "What now?" Ethan muttered. Lyria's composure cracked for the first time, a flicker of worry crossing her face. This ship is supposed to be one of the most advanced in the galaxy. How could it be compromised? Ethan's instincts as an engineer kicked in. "Maybe I can help. I've worked on ship systems before." Lyria scoffed. "A human? Fixing a Zetheri vessel? I doubt it." Ignoring her skepticism, Ethan approached the control panel. "Look, I don't care about your opinion of humans. If there's a chance I can help, let me try." Lyria hesitated, then stepped aside. "Fine, but don't touch anything until I say so." Ethan studied the holographic interface. The symbols were unfamiliar, but the basic layout of the system reminded him of human designs. "It's not too different from what I've seen before," he muttered. "Let's see." As Ethan worked, Lyria watched him with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Despite his rough appearance, he moved with confidence, his hands gliding over the controls as if he belonged there. "You're not as useless as I thought," Lyria admitted grudgingly. "Thanks for the vote of confidence," Ethan replied dryly. "But we're not out of the woods yet." The AI's voice returned. "Warning. Intruder signal detected. Lockdown protocols escalating." Lyria stiffened. "Intruders? How is that possible?" Ethan frowned. "The ship's defenses should have detected them earlier. Something's messing with your systems." "Then fix it," Lyria snapped. "I'm trying." Ethan shot back, frustration creeping into his voice. As the two worked together, tension crackled in the air. Lyria's regal demeanor made her seem untouchable, but Ethan couldn't help noticing the faint hints of vulnerability she tried to hide. Meanwhile, Lyria found herself reluctantly impressed by the human's resourcefulness. He wasn't the clueless drifter she had assumed. Minutes later, Ethan managed to bypass a critical error in the system. The lockdown lifted, and the ship's internal sensors came back online. "There," Ethan said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Now we can see what's going on." A holographic display lit up, showing a cluster of small ships circling the Ecliptica. Lyria's expression darkened. "Pirates. They must have followed me." Ethan glanced at her. "Followed you? Why?" "That's none of your concern," Lyria said sharply. "What matters is that we're both in danger now." Ethan sighed. "Great. Just what I needed. A life-threatening situation with no way out. The AI interrupted again. Threat escalating. Hostile ships attempting to breach the hull. Lyria clenched her fists. We can't let them board. If they capture me, the consequences will be catastrophic. Ethan frowned. What's so special about you? Lyria hesitated, then said quietly, I am not just any Zetheri. If they take me, it could ignite a war. Ethan's eyes widened. No pressure, huh? Despite the gravity of the situation, Lyria smirked faintly. Perhaps humans aren't as slow as I thought. Before Ethan could respond, the ship shuddered violently. The first breach had begun. Get ready, human, Lyria said, her tone icy and determined. If we're going to survive this, we'll have to work together. Ethan nodded. Let's hope your royal attitude comes with some battle skills. As the two prepared to face the impending danger, an unspoken understanding formed between them. For better or worse, their fates were now intertwined. Secrets of the alien princess. Ethan sat against the cold metal wall, his chest heaving from the effort of patching up the ship's damaged systems. The faint hum of the Ecliptica's engines returned, a small but vital victory. Across the room, Princess Lyria paced in sharp, deliberate movements. Her silver eyes gleamed with a mixture of anger and unease. You're hiding something, Ethan said, breaking the tense silence. He wasn't sure if it was the confined space, the adrenaline, or sheer frustration that emboldened him to confront her. Lyria stopped pacing and turned to him, her expression as sharp as a blade. What gives you the right to speak to me that way, human? I could eject you into space for your insolence. Yeah, you could, Ethan replied, leaning his head back against the wall. But you won't, because you need me as much as I need you. Her nostrils flared, but she said nothing. Instead, she folded her arms across her chest and looked away. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Look, Ethan said, softening his tone. I get it. You're royalty. You've got your secrets. But if we're going to survive this, you have to trust me a little. Lyria let out a low, humorless laugh. Trust a human. Do you even know what your kind has done to my people? Ethan frowned. I'm an engineer, not a politician. I don't know what humans have done to your kind, but I'm not them. I didn't ask to be here. And I certainly didn't ask to be stuck in the middle of whatever mess you're running from. Her gaze snapped back to him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Ethan thought she might lash out. But then her shoulders sagged, and she sighed. A sound so human it caught him off guard. Fine, she said, her voice quieter now. You want to know the truth. I am the heir to the Zetheri Empire. My father, the king, arranged for me to marry a warlord from the Draganus system, a brute with no regard for diplomacy or peace. It was a political alliance to strengthen our military standing. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Let me guess, you weren't on board with that plan. She shot him a withering look. Would you be? I fled the moment I had the chance. This ship was supposed to take me to a safe haven. But now, she gestured vaguely at the malfunctioning vessel. Now I'm stuck with a human and a ship that's falling apart. Ethan whistled softly. You've got guts, I'll give you that. But running from a warlord, that's a pretty big gamble. Lyria tilted her head, her expression softening slightly. Sometimes, the only way to fight is to run. At least, that's what I told myself. Before Ethan could respond, the ship shuddered violently, throwing them both off balance. Lyria caught herself against the wall, while Ethan sprawled onto the floor. What now? He groaned, pulling himself up. The AI's voice crackled to life. Warning. Unidentified energy waves detected. Potential threat to physical and emotional stability of organic occupants. Lyria's eyes widened. The nebula, she muttered. We've drifted into its core. What's the big deal? Ethan asked, brushing himself off. It's just some space dust, right? Hardly, Lyria snapped. The nebula emits waves that amplify emotions, fear, anger, even desire. Prolonged exposure can drive beings to madness. Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's temperature. Great, as if things weren't bad enough. The tension between them thickened as the effects of the nebula began to take hold. Lyria's usual sharpness seemed to waver, her expression softening in ways Ethan had never seen before. He, too, felt a strange pull, an unexplainable connection that he couldn't shake. "Ethan," Lyria said suddenly, her voice almost hesitant. "Do you feel it?" He hesitated, unsure of what to say. "Yeah," he admitted finally. "I do, but I'm not sure what it means." Lyria looked away, her cheeks darkening with what Ethan could only interpret as a blush. "It's the nebula," she said quickly. "Nothing more. Don't let it distract you." Ethan nodded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. "Right. The nebula. Got it." But as the ship groaned around them, the two couldn't shake the growing sense of connection. Something more profound than either of them was ready to admit, and with every passing moment, the nebula's influence grew stronger. "Come on," Ethan said, breaking the tension. "We've got to stabilize the ship before it tears us apart." Lyria nodded, but the look in her eyes lingered. A mixture of fear, vulnerability, and something else Ethan couldn't quite place. As they worked side by side to repair the failing systems, the unspoken bond between them deepened, even as they both tried to deny it. And somewhere in the swirling chaos of the nebula, the seeds of an impossible connection began to take root. The unseen threat. The flickering lights aboard the Ecliptica cast long, eerie shadows as Ethan and Lyria worked in silence. The ship had stabilized temporarily, but the oppressive hum of the nebula and the occasional groan of the hull reminded them they were far from safe. Ethan's hands moved deftly over the controls, trying to reroute power to essential systems, while Lyria stood by, her sharp gaze scanning the room like a predator on edge. "I can't shake the feeling we're being watched," Ethan said, breaking the silence. Lyria's head snapped toward him. "Don't say things like that lightly. In Zetheri culture, such thoughts invite danger." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Superstitious, are we?" Before she could retort, the ship's AI interrupted with an emotionless tone. "Warning. Unauthorized signal detected. Possible hostile entity attempting to breach the system." Lyria's entire body tensed. Hostile entity. What does it mean? Ethan frowned, leaning closer to the console. "It means someone, or something, is trying to hack into your ship." Lyria's voice hardened. "Impossible. Zetheri ships have the most advanced cybersecurity in the galaxy." "Yeah. Well, tell that to whoever's knocking on your back door," Ethan shot back, typing furiously on the control panel. "I'll try to block the signal, but whoever's doing this knows what they're doing." The lights flickered again, this time accompanied by a low, ominous rumble. Lyria's sharp intake of breath drew Ethan's attention. "What now?" he asked, his voice tinged with exasperation. "Look," Lyria whispered, pointing to the holographic display. The screen showed a cluster of small, sleek ships circling the Ecliptica like vultures. Their black, spiked designs were unmistakable, even to Ethan, who had never encountered them before. "Who are they?" he asked, his stomach knotting. "Draganus raiders," Lyria said, her voice barely audible. "They must have tracked me here." Ethan turned to her, confusion and anger flashing in his eyes. "You knew they might come after you, didn't you? And you didn't think to mention it." Lyria's silver eyes flared with indignation. "I didn't expect them to find me this quickly. Besides, I didn't think you'd be of any use against them." "Well, thanks for the vote of confidence," Ethan muttered. "But now we've got a bigger problem. These ships aren't just circling for fun. They're trying to board us." As if on cue, the AI spoke again. "Warning. Hull breach detected. Enemy forces infiltrating cargo bay." Lyria's hands balled into fists. "We need to stop them. If they take this ship, they'll not only capture me but gain access to classified Zetheri technology." Ethan's heart raced. "How are we supposed to fight them off?" "I'm an engineer," not a soldier. I am, Lyria said, her voice steady and cold. Ethan blinked. Wait, what? I was trained in combat from a young age, Lyria said, striding toward a concealed panel on the wall. With a quick press of her hand, it slid open, revealing an array of sleek alien weapons. She grabbed a pair of glowing daggers and a small energy pistol before tossing another weapon to Ethan. He caught it awkwardly, nearly dropping it. What am I supposed to do with this? Point and shoot, Lyria said briskly. Just don't hit me. Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but a loud metallic crash interrupted him. The sound echoed through the corridors, growing louder with each passing second. They're in, Lyria said, her voice a deadly calm. Ethan's palms grew clammy as he gripped the unfamiliar weapon. I can't believe this is happening. Lyria smirked, a dangerous glint in her eyes. Stay close to me, human. You might survive if you listen. The two moved through the dimly lit corridors, the sound of heavy footsteps drawing closer. Lyria's movements were fluid and silent, like a predator stalking its prey. Ethan did his best to follow her lead, though his nerves threatened to betray him at every turn. As they approached the cargo bay, the sight of hulking figures in jagged armor sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. The Draganus raiders were even more intimidating up close, their reptilian features twisted into cruel sneers. Their weapons crackled with energy, and their guttural language filled the air with a menacing tone. Lyria wasted no time. She leaped into action, her daggers flashing like streaks of light. The first raider barely had time to react before she struck, her movements a blur of precision and power. Ethan watched in stunned silence as she took down two more raiders with a combination of agility and sheer force. Don't just stand there, Lyria shouted, snapping him out of his trance. Ethan raised his weapon, his hands shaking. He squeezed the trigger, and a bolt of energy shot out, narrowly missing one of the raiders. The alien turned toward him, its glowing red eyes narrowing. Oh, great, Ethan muttered, backpedaling as the raider charged. Before it could reach him, Lyria appeared out of nowhere, driving her dagger into the creature's chest. It let out a guttural roar before collapsing to the ground. You're welcome, she said, flashing him a brief smirk. Yeah, thanks, Ethan said, his heart pounding. Remind me never to make you angry. The sound of more footsteps echoed through the corridors. Lyria's expression hardened. This isn't over. They'll keep coming until they get what they want. Ethan swallowed hard. And what exactly do they want? She hesitated, her gaze flickering with something Ethan couldn't quite place. Me, she said finally. And now, you. Me, Ethan said, incredulous. Why would they want me? Because you're with me, Lyria said simply. And to them, that makes you a threat. The weight of her words settled heavily on Ethan's shoulders. Whatever he'd gotten himself into, there was no turning back now. And as the sound of the raiders grew louder, he realized that surviving this ordeal would require far more than just his engineering skills. A growing bond. The sound of approaching footsteps reverberated through the narrow hallways of the Ecliptica, growing louder as more raiders rushed to converge on Ethan and Lyria. The tension between them was palpable, but neither spoke a word. The only sound was the occasional click of their weapons and the hum of the ship's failing systems. Ethan's heart was pounding in his chest, his mind racing. Every corner they rounded seemed to bring them closer to the inevitable, more Draganus raiders. Yet, as they moved swiftly through the ship's corridors, there was an unspoken understanding growing between him and Lyria. Despite the chaos, something deeper, something entirely unexpected, was beginning to form. Lyria, with her effortless grace and deadly precision, was an enigma. She had been nothing but cold and distant when they first met, but now, in the heat of battle, she had begun to rely on him in ways that made Ethan feel like more than just a tool to be used. And he, despite his fear and uncertainty, had started to notice things about her, things that hinted at a side of her no one ever saw. The vulnerability behind her eyes, the subtle hesitations, the way she seemed to care even when she didn't want to admit it. "Down this way," Lyria ordered, her voice firm, as she guided him toward an abandoned maintenance bay. Ethan nodded quickly, glancing over his shoulder at the distant shadows that threatened to swallow them whole. "We need to find a way to fight back. This is insane. I'm an engineer, not a soldier. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." Lyria stopped and turned to face him. Her piercing silver eyes met his, her expression unreadable. "You've already done more than I expected, human," she said, her voice almost softer than it had ever been. "You may not be a soldier, but you've done more than anyone could have asked of you. You're still alive, and so am I." Ethan blinked, taken aback by the raw honesty in her words. "You're thanking me? I thought you hated humans." For a brief moment, Lyria's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles, a fleeting, almost imperceptible thing. "I don't hate humans," she said, her tone shifting, just slightly warmer. "I've simply never seen one like you. You're different. Fight or flight." The battle was over, but the aftermath was anything but peaceful. Ethan and Lyria stood in the heart of the reactor room, their breaths ragged, the acrid smell of burnt circuitry and alien flesh hanging heavy in the air. The last of the raiders lay motionless on the floor, their twisted forms marking the end of yet another skirmish. But the battle wasn't truly over. Not yet. Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow, his mind still buzzing from the chaos of the fight. He glanced over at Lyria, whose calm and calculated demeanor had never faltered, even in the heat of battle. Her clothes were torn, her hair disheveled, but there was an unyielding fire in her eyes that Ethan found both captivating and terrifying. "Is it always like this for you?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Lyria didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked over to the reactor's control panel and began pressing a sequence of buttons, her fingers moving with swift precision. The hum of the core's energy shifted slightly, but the reactor remained unstable. "We're not out of danger yet," she said finally, her voice devoid of emotion. "The damage to the ship's core is more extensive than I anticipated. If we don't stabilize it within the next few minutes, we'll be caught in the gravitational pull of the nearby black hole. There won't be enough time to escape." Ethan's pulse quickened. "A black hole. That's the emergency I've been hearing about." Lyria nodded, her silver eyes fixed on the redouts in front of her. "Yes, the ship's engines are compromised. The gravity from the black hole is pulling us in. If we don't stop it, the ecliptica will be torn apart." He looked around at the wreckage of the room. The last of the raiders had been dealt with, but the damage they'd caused was immense. Energy conduits sparked intermittently, and one of the walls had been torn open, exposing the raw metal of the ship's skeleton. "We need to fix this," Ethan said, determination rising in his chest. "I don't care how. Just tell me what to do." Lyria turned to face him, her gaze intense. "You've already done enough, human. You've survived this long, and I don't expect you to do any more. This is my responsibility." "Vol," Ethan shot back, stepping forward. "If we're going to make it out of here, we have to do this together." For a long moment, their eyes locked. Ethan could feel the weight of her gaze, the complex emotions swirling beneath her steely exterior. Finally, she gave a small nod. "Fine. Together then. But don't get in my way." "I'll try not to," Ethan replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But inside, something had shifted. There was a newfound respect for Lyria, something deeper than the initial coldness between them. He didn't fully understand it, but he knew that she wasn't just some aloof princess anymore. She was someone who could fight for what she believed in, someone who could lead. Together, they turned their focus to the ship's core, working in tandem as the ship groaned ominously around them. Lyria's expertise was evident in every movement, but Ethan found that his own engineering skills were invaluable. The more they worked, the more Ethan felt like he was truly becoming a part of something greater than himself. The gravity of the situation, both literally and metaphorically, began to weigh on him. Despite the immediate danger, He couldn't ignore the fact that he was growing closer to Lyria. Her strength, her vulnerability, and the way she led with such quiet authority made him question everything he'd known about her. He wasn't just helping her to survive anymore. Something about this situation was pulling him in, and he couldn't quite figure out what it was. As the minutes ticked away, Ethan found himself increasingly aware of how their bodies moved in close proximity. They worked together seamlessly, but there was a strange tension between them that neither could ignore. It wasn't just the urgency of the situation. It was something deeper, a connection that neither of them had expected. Lyria was the first to break the silence. "I don't know if this is going to work," she admitted, her voice softer now. "I've never been in a situation quite like this before. I've fought. I've led, but never with this kind of urgency. I've never had someone by my side in this way." Ethan glanced at her, surprised by the rare admission. "I get it," he said, his voice low. "I didn't expect to be here either, but I'm not going to leave you hanging." Lyria looked at him then, really looked at him, for the first time since this whole ordeal began. Her eyes softened, and for a brief moment, the walls she had carefully built around herself seemed to crack. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice almost vulnerable. "I wasn't sure what to expect from you, but you've surprised me." Ethan felt his heart skip a beat at her words. He wasn't sure if it was the nebula messing with his emotions or something deeper, but he felt a rush of warmth spread through him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. There was something undeniably real between them, something that couldn't be ignored. "We're not out of the woods yet," Ethan said, trying to keep things focused. "But I'm not going anywhere. We fix this core, and we get out of here." Lyria nodded, and they both returned to their work, the momentary pause hanging in the air like a fragile thread. The ship's core hummed louder, the gravitational pull of the black hole getting stronger. Time was running out. With the final adjustments made, Lyria punched in a sequence of commands, and the reactor's energy surged back to life, stabilizing the ship's core. The gravitational pull from the black hole began to weaken, and the ecliptica slowly started to right itself. Ethan exhaled sharply, the tension in his body finally easing. But before he could say anything, Lyria grabbed his arm, pulling him to the side just as the walls around them rattled with another explosion. "They're back," she said, her voice urgent. Ethan's stomach sank. "How is that possible? We just neutralized them." Lyria's face grew grim. "This isn't over, human. They'll stop at nothing to get what they want. Me." Ethan's resolve hardened. "Then let's make sure they don't get anything." The final confession. The weight of the ecliptica's internal alarms was almost unbearable. Red lights flashed above them, and the walls shook violently with each passing second. Every creak and groan of the ship felt like it was urging them forward, but neither Ethan nor Lyria had any intention of leaving until they had dealt with the immediate threat. The Draganus raiders were still aboard, and if they didn't act quickly, the battle would be over before it even began. As the two of them navigated the darkened, flickering halls, the space between them felt charged. The nebula's effects still pulsed in the background, amplifying emotions, pushing them closer to each other, even if neither of them was quite ready to face it. They had worked together in silence, side by side, their lives interwoven in a way neither of them could fully comprehend. But the urgency of the moment now pushed them toward a precipice, and neither knew how much longer they could deny what had been building between them. "We need to get to the control room," Lyria said, her voice low and focused as she quickened her pace. "It's the only place left that's still functional." Ethan nodded, glancing around at the flickering lights. "Right. But after that, what do we do? We can't just keep running from them forever." Lyria's expression was unreadable, the sharp edge of her royal persona cutting through the tension in the air. But as they reached the final door to the control room, she hesitated. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't know what comes after this. If we survive this, I don't know where I go. Where we go." Ethan looked at her then, his gaze softening. We go wherever we can make it. Together, if that's what you want. I don't know what's going to happen. But we've already been through too much to just turn back now." She seemed taken aback by his words, and for the briefest moment, the cold barrier she had erected around her heart seemed to waver. She was about to say something more, but the sound of heavy footsteps interrupted her thoughts. The raiders had found them again. "Get ready," she said, her voice sharpening, returning to the commanding tone she wore so well. Ethan swallowed hard, but his resolve firmed. He didn't know what was going on between them. He didn't know why he was suddenly willing to risk his life, not just for survival, but for her. But there was no time to figure it out. They had to stop the raiders. Now. The control room door slid open with a hiss, and they were immediately met with a brutal firefight. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the first raider charged toward him, blaster raised. He fired instinctively, his shot landing squarely in the raider's chest. But it didn't stop the others. The remaining raiders began to advance, their weapons crackling with dangerous energy. Lyria dove into the fray, her movements a blur of precision and deadly force. The power of her blows sent raiders tumbling across the room, and she moved with the kind of grace Ethan had only seen in highly trained warriors. She wasn't just defending herself. She was commanding the space around her, every step calculated and swift. Ethan wasn't sure where his own confidence came from, but he kept pace with her. He fired at the raiders with more accuracy than he'd ever thought himself capable of. His hands, usually steady with tools, were now steady with a weapon. Every shot he took seemed to hit its mark, and with each raider that fell, his confidence grew. But then, a raider broke through their defenses, pushing toward the control panel. Ethan barely had time to react before Lyria moved faster than he thought possible, her dagger slashing through the air in one fluid motion. The raider fell, and she was already moving toward the console. "Get to the main controls," Lyria barked, her voice sharp, her focus unwavering. "Override the lockdown." Ethan was about to argue, but the urgency in her voice stopped him cold. He moved toward the control panel, his fingers flying over the console, trying to bypass the security systems that the raiders had set in place. As he worked, Lyria stood guard, her eyes scanning the room, watching for any signs of movement. The tension between them hung in the air, even amid the chaos. It wasn't just the fear of the battle. It was something deeper, something neither of them wanted to acknowledge. But it was there, unspoken. "You're doing it," Lyria said suddenly, her voice quieter now, softer. "You're actually doing it." Ethan paused, looking up at her for the first time in what felt like hours. Her silver eyes met his, and for a moment he saw something there, something raw and vulnerable that she had hidden so well behind her royal facade. She wasn't just a princess fighting for survival anymore. She was a woman who had been forced into impossible circumstances, who had borne the weight of her empire's expectations alone. And in some inexplicable way, Ethan had become part of that world. "It's just a console," Ethan said, trying to deflect the weight of the moment with a joke. But his voice was unsteady, his heart racing for a different reason now. "You've got all the fancy alien technology. I'm just trying not to screw it up." But Lyria shook her head, her expression softening, her eyes searching his. "No, you've done more than that. You've shown me that humans aren't just disposable. You've shown me what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "Lyria." But she silenced him with a look. "I don't know what's going to happen after this, Ethan. If we survive this, I don't know what's left for me. I don't even know if you'll want anything to do with me after all of this. But I do know one thing." "What's that?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lyria took a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly. "I don't want to face it alone. I don't want to lose what we've built." Before Ethan could respond, the control panel beeped, signaling that the lockdown was deactivated. The ship's systems hummed to life again, and the heavy pressure of the black hole's gravitational pull eased slightly. The immediate danger had passed. But the moment between them lingered, unspoken and unresolved. Neither of them knew what came next. They had survived the raiders, but the battle wasn't just about fighting for their lives anymore. It was about confronting the growing, undeniable connection between them, one that neither of them had expected, but neither could deny. "I think we should focus on getting out of here first," Ethan said, his voice hoarse. "Everything else we'll deal with later." Lyria nodded, her face hardening once again as she turned toward the doors. "Later," she agreed, but her voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. As they moved forward, side by side, Ethan couldn't help but wonder if the real fight was just beginning. Escape and new beginnings. The Ecliptica was still in freefall, but the immediate threat of the black hole's gravitational pull had lessened. Yet with every passing second, Ethan could feel the ship's systems faltering under the strain. The hull groaned, the lights flickering intermittently as though the ship itself were holding on by a thread. The battle with the Draganus raiders had taken its toll, and the ship's damage was too extensive to ignore. But they had survived. Barely. Ethan glanced at Lyria, whose regal composure had returned after the chaos of the battle. She moved with purpose, her gaze sharp as she surveyed the control panels. Despite the pain she must have been feeling, physical or emotional, she had never once faltered. She was a leader in every sense of the word. And in some strange way, she had let him into her world, letting him fight beside her, trust him in ways she had never trusted anyone else. Ethan still couldn't quite process how everything had unfolded, how this human engineer, thrown into a situation he never could have predicted, had become entwined in the fate of a princess and her empire. Yet here he was, at the edge of something far bigger than himself. "We need to evacuate," Lyria said, her voice as steady as it had been in the midst of the fight. "The ship is no longer viable. We're losing power faster than we can regenerate." Ethan's heart sank as he looked around at the dying ship. Despite everything, he didn't want to leave it behind. The Ecliptica had become a symbol of their struggle, a constant reminder of what they had been through together. But Lyria was right. They had no choice. "What's the plan?" Ethan asked, pulling himself together as best as he could. He had been more of a bystander than a true hero, just trying to fix what was broken and keep everyone alive long enough to make it out. But now, as the ship continued to break apart around them, he felt the urgency more acutely than ever. "We'll take the escape pods," Lyria said, her voice calm but tinged with a hint of sadness. "There's a remote outpost nearby, a safe haven for people like me. If we can make it there, we'll be able to regroup." Ethan's gaze softened. He wasn't sure if the thought of finding safety or of being alone with Lyria was more appealing. But one thing was clear: whatever came next, he wasn't going to let her face it alone. The connection between them, undeniable and potent, had only grown stronger through the chaos. "Lead the way," Ethan said, his voice firm. "I'm with you, Lyria. Wherever we end up, I'm with you." For a moment, she looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. Her expression was guarded, as always, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of gratitude, maybe, or something deeper, something she wasn't ready to admit. Together, they made their way to the escape pods, their footsteps echoing in the abandoned corridors of the Ecliptica. The last of the ship's artificial gravity gave way as they reached the pod bay, and they floated toward the nearest pods with a sense of finality. "Here," Lyria said, pressing a button that released one of the pods. The small vessel floated in front of them, its sleek design glowing faintly in the dim light. Ethan climbed inside first, securing his harness before reaching his hand out to Lyria. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped in beside him, her presence as commanding as ever. As the pod doors sealed with a soft hiss, Lyria's fingers moved quickly across the control panel, setting the course for the outpost. The engines ignited with a low, resonating hum, and the pod surged forward, breaking free of the Ecliptica's failing orbit. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the stars outside the windows seeming so distant, so infinite. The nebula they had survived seemed like a distant memory now, and yet the weight of everything that had happened still hung heavy in the air. Ethan glanced at Lyria, his heart pounding in his chest. "So, what happens now?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Lyria's gaze softened as she looked at him, the cold barrier around her heart finally starting to melt. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice a rare mix of vulnerability and hope. "But whatever it is, we face it together." Ethan felt his heart skip a beat at her words. There was no denying it anymore. The bond between them had grown too strong to ignore. He had fought by her side, and she had fought by his. In a galaxy filled with unknowns, there was one thing he was certain of. He wasn't alone, and neither was she. As the pod glided toward the outpost, Lyria turned to him, a soft smile tugging at the corners of her lips. It was the first time in what felt like ages that he had seen her truly smile, free of the weight of responsibility, of the burden of leadership. She was just Lyria, in that moment, a woman who had survived impossible odds and found something unexpected in the process. "I never thought I'd say this, but thank you, Ethan," she said softly, her voice sincere. "I never could have made it this far without you." Ethan's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, the world outside the pod seemed to fade away. "You don't have to thank me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've done more for me than I could ever repay." Lyria reached out, her hand brushing his ever so slightly. The touch was fleeting, but it carried a weight that both of them could feel. It was a promise of more than just survival, of something more fragile and more enduring than anything they had expected. As the pod neared the outpost, the stars outside gleamed brighter, and the unknown future stretched ahead of them like an open door. Together, they would face whatever came next, whether it was danger, uncertainty, or the possibility of something even more extraordinary. And as they finally touched down on the unfamiliar world, Ethan realized that the greatest journey of all wasn't about survival. It was about what came after. It was about finding hope in the darkest of places, and it was about finding each other.